Hello everybody, this is Mr. Broomfield and Alila, and I'm going to read chapter 4 today of Paddington. The chapter is called A Shopping Expedition. The man in the gentleman's outfitting department at Barkridge's held Paddington's hat at arm's length between thumb and forefinger, and he looked at it distastefully. I take it the young man will not be requiring this any more, madam, he said. Oh, yes, I shall, said Paddington firmly. I've always had that hat ever since I was small. But wouldn't you like a nice new one, Paddington? Said Mrs. Brown hastily. For best? Paddington thought for a moment. I'll have one for worst if you like. That's my best one. The salesman shuddered slightly and, averting his gaze, placed the offending article on the far end of the counter. Albert, he beckoned to a youth who was hovering in the background. See what we have in size 4 7/8. Albert began to rummage around the counter. And now, while we're about it, said Mrs. Brown, would like a nice warm coat for the winter. Something like a duffel coat with toggles so that he can do it up easily. And we'd also like a plastic raincoat for the summer. The salesman looked at her hauntingly. He wasn't very fond of bears, and this one especially had given him queer looks ever since he'd mentioned his wretched hat. Has madam tried the bargain basement? He began. Something in the government surplus? No, I haven't, said Mrs. Brown hotly. Government surplus, indeed. I've never heard of such a thing. Have you, Paddington? No, said Paddington, who had no idea what government surplus was. Never. He stared hard at the man, who looked away uneasily. Paddington had a very persistent stare, and when he cared to use it, it was a very powerful stare. One which his Aunt Lucy had taught him, which he kept for special occasions. Mrs. Brown pointed to a smart blue duffel coat with a red lining. That looks like the very thing, she said. The assistant gulped. Yes, madam, certainly, madam, he beckoned to Paddington. Come this way, sir. Paddington followed the assistant, keeping about 2 feet behind him and staring very hard. The back of the man's neck seemed to go a dull red, and he fingered his collar nervously. What do you think, Alula? As they passed the hat counter, Albert, who lived in constant fear of his superior and who had been watching the events with an open mouth, gave Paddington the thumbs up. Paddington waved a paw, and he was beginning to enjoy himself. He allowed the assistant to help him with the coat, and he stood there admiring himself in the mirror. It was the first coat he had ever had. In Peru, it had been very hot, and his Aunt Lucy did make him wear a hat so he didn't get sunburn, and it had always been too warm for a coat. He looked at himself in the mirror, and he was surprised to see not one, but in fact a long line of bears stretching away as far as the eye could see. Alila, you're a bit distracting. In fact, everywhere he looked there were bears, and they were all looking extremely smart. Isn't the hood a trifle large? Asked Mrs. Brown anxiously. Hoods are being worn large this year, madam, said the assistant. It's the latest fashion. And he was about to add that Paddington seemed to have a rather large head anyway, but he changed his mind. Bears were rather unpredictable. You never quite knew what they were thinking, and this one definitely had a mind of his own. Do you like it, Paddington? Asked Mrs. Brown. Paddington gave up counting bears in the mirror and turned around to have a look at the back view. I think it's the nicest coat I've ever seen, he said. After a moment's thought, Mrs. Brown and the assistant heaved a sigh of relief. Good, said Mrs. Brown. That's settled then. Now, there's the question of the hat and the plastic mackintosh. A mackintosh is a bit like a waterproof coat. She walked over to the hat counter where Albert, who could still hardly take his admiring eyes off Paddington, had arranged a huge pile of hats. There were bowler hats, sun hats, trilby hats, berets, and even a very small top hat. Mrs. Brown eyed them doubtfully. It's difficult, she said, looking at Paddington. It's largely a question of his ears. They stick out a bit. You could cut some holes in them, said Albert, and the assistant froze with a glance. Cut a hole? In one of our bakerage hats? He exclaimed. I've never heard of such thing. Paddington turned and stared at him. The assistant's voice trailed off. I'll go and fetch the scissors, he said in a quiet voice. I don't think that will be necessary at all, said Mrs. Brown hurriedly. It's not as though he's going to work in the city. He doesn't need anything too smart. I think this woolen beret is very nice. The one with the pompon on top. The green will go well with his new jacket. And it'll stretch so he can pull it down over his ears when it gets cold. Everyone agreed that Paddington looked very smart. And while Mrs. Brown looked for a plastic mackintosh, he trotted off to have another look at himself in the mirror. He found the beret was a little difficult to raise as his ears kept the bottom half firmly in place. But by pulling the pom-pom, he could make it stretch quite a lot. And that was almost as good. It meant too that he could be polite without getting his ears cold. The assistant wanted to wrap up the duffel coat for him, but after a lot of fuss, it was agreed that even though it was a warm day, he was going to wear it. Paddington felt very proud of himself, and he was anxious to see if people noticed. After shaking hands with Albert, Paddington gave the assistant one more long, hard stare. And the unfortunate man collapsed into a chair and began mopping his brow as Mrs. Brown led the way through the door. Bakeridge's was a very large shop, and it even had its own escalator, as well as several lifts. Mrs. Brown hesitated at the door and then took Paddington's paw firmly and in her hand and led him towards the lift. She had even had enough of the escalators for one day. But to Paddington, everything was new. Well, almost everything, and he liked to try strange things. After a few seconds, he decided quite definitely that he preferred riding escalators compared to lifts. They were nice and smooth, but lifts? To start with, it was full of people carrying small parcels, and so busy that no one had time to notice the small bear. One woman even rested her shopping bag on top of his head. And she seemed quite surprised when Paddington pushed it off. Then suddenly half of them seemed to fall away and the other half stayed still. He had a strange feeling in his tummy. Just as he got used to the feeling, the second half of him caught up again and overtook the first half, and then the doors opened. It did that 4 times on the way down, and Paddington was glad when the man in charge said it was on the ground floor, and Mrs. Brown led him out. She looked at him closely. Oh dear, Paddington, you look quite pale. Are you all right? I feel sick, said Paddington. I don't like lifts, and I wish I didn't have such a big breakfast. Oh dear, Mrs. Brown looked around. Judy had gone off to do some shopping on her own and was nowhere to be seen. Will you be all right sitting here for a few minutes and I'll go and find Judy? Paddington sank down onto his case, looking very mournful. Even the pom-pom on his hat seemed a bit limp. I don't know whether I shall be all right, he said, but I'll do my best. I'll be as quick as I can, said Mrs. Brown. Then we can get a taxi home for lunch. Paddington groaned. Poor Paddington, said Mrs. Brown. You must be feeling bad if you don't want lunch. At that word lunch again, Paddington closed his eyes and gave an even louder groan. Mrs. Brown tiptoed away. Paddington kept his eyes closed for several minutes, and then, as he began to feel better, he gradually became aware, every now and again, a nice cool draught blew over his face. He opened one eye carefully to see where it was coming from, and noticed for the first time that he was sitting near the main entrance to the shop. He opened his other eye and decided to investigate. If he stayed just outside the glass door, he could still see Mrs. Brown and Judy when they came. Oh, that doesn't sound like a good idea. And then, as he bent down to pick up his suitcase, everything suddenly went black. Oh dear, thought Paddington. Now all the lights have gone out. What do you think's happened, Alila? Yes, maybe. He began groping his way through with outstretched paws towards the door. He gave a push where he thought it ought to be, but nothing happened. And he tried moving along a bit along the wall, and he gave it another push. This time it did move. The door seemed to have a strong spring on it, and he had to push quite hard to make it open. But eventually there was a gap that was big enough to him to squeeze through, and it clanged shut behind him. Paddington was disappointed to find out it was dark outside too. He began to wish he'd stayed where he was. He turned around and tried to find the door, but it seemed to disappear. He decided it might be easier if he got down on his paws and crawled. He went a little way like this, and then his head came up against something hard. He tried to push it to one side with his paw, and it moved slightly. And that's it. That's the end of my part of reading. I don't know what's happened to Paddington. I think maybe something's happened with his hat. If you know what's happened, add a comment at the bottom, and Alila will check it to see if you're right. Okay, bye!